One of my favorite time periods in the Star Wars Expanded Universe is the 10 or so years after the Battle of Endor, when you have warlords, remnant factions, and want-to-be emperors and empresses fighting to either unify the Empire or carve out a little bit of territory for themselves. In today's video, I've taken a bunch of my videos on the Warlord era, removed all the sponsor integrations, the ads, and put them together. As always, if you want to skip ahead or rewatch something, timestamps down below. Let's roll it. The Sairu were a brutal saurian species who relied largely on a unique technology known as entekment, which drained energy from living beings, which was used to power their ships and weaponry. With the death of Emperor Palpatine at the Battle of Endor, they attacked the galaxy at large, first targeting the planet Bakura. Bakura, which was under control by the Empire, had to face off against a scout fleet comprised of 5 cruisers, some smaller ships, and a complement of droid starfighters. The defensive fleet, although overwhelmed, was able to push the Sairu into a temporary retreat. However, fearing an invasion from the full Sairu military, Imperial leadership on the planet sent a distress call to the Death Star 2 and Imperial Center on Coruscant. The New Republic, or technically the Rebel Alliance on this point, were still on Endor after the destruction of the Death Star 2. They sent a small task force led by Luke Skywalker to help protect the planet as a means to generate goodwill in the new wannabe government. Specifically, Luke was put in command of a Quasar-class carrier, a CR-90, 5 DP-20s, the Falcon, and 20 or so starfighters. The task force arrived at the planet and a truce was brokered, with Princess Leia serving as rebel negotiator. She passed on the news of the Emperor's death and promised that at the end of the conflict, the Alliance would leave peacefully and not require the Empire to surrender the planet. A defensive web over the planet was established, with both factions creating a unified military strategy. At this point, the Sairu appear and blockade the planet. Here we get some good detail about the forces on both sides. We get the following quote: "According to my data, between us we've got 2 cruisers, 7 mid-sized gunships, and about 40 one-man fighters, 2/3 currently deployed in the defensive web, 1/3 down for repairs. The Sairu have 3 cruisers, 2 mid-sized planetary assault ships, about 15 large fighters or small picket ships, and many droid-controlled starfighters. One thing I find interesting is how rebel fighters were used in conjunction with TIEs. There's obviously a serious difference in starfighter quality, and as the rebels run battle simulations, Han Solo is actually the one to point out the difference. He says, "You've got alliance fighting pairs at every group of maximum risk," when in reality, some of those groups would be made up of TIE fighters. Your projection isn't showing losses by subgroup. If you fed those in, there'd be a lot less silver dots in the completion frame. I don't like that. Basically, what he means is the projections don't take into account the fact that TIEs are much less effective. In noting this, Alliance fighters are placed in areas where they can do the most damage. Under the guise of a diplomatic meeting, Luke Skywalker is kidnapped by the Sairu, who had secretly been working with the traitorous Imperial Governor Nurez and hoped to use Skywalker to power their entekment technology. As a cover for their escape with the Jedi, the Sairu also at this point attacked the Bakuran defense grid. With attention elsewhere, the Sairu and the captive Skywalker successfully docked with the Sairu flagship, the Sri Weir. Luke of course was able to free himself and managed to cause major havoc across the ship, ruining Sairu battle tactics. So things were already going fairly poorly for the aliens. The Rebels and Imperials also seemed to be better tacticians, and a fighter squadron made up of the Falcon, Rebel starfighters, and several TIEs were able to destroy a cruiser, while the Empire destroyed another by ramming it. As this was happening, Luke made his way towards the flagship's bridge, turning its weapons against friendly cruisers. The Sairu were very quickly now totally disorganized and defeated. Most ships still left retreated relatively quickly. But that wasn't all, and this is where the battle took on a new dimension. The Empire, seeing an excuse to take out Skywalker and the Sairu flagship, began to move their ships into position to destroy the Sri Weir. At the vanguard was the Imperial flagship Dominant, a Carrack-class cruiser. Unfortunately, because of some damage it had sustained over the battle, as well as a long history of poor maintenance, its engines were disabled and it was not able to fire on Luke. However, as the rebels tried to reorganize themselves, realizing what was happening, the Dominant was able to destroy the rebel flagship, the Flurry, as well as several starfighters. As this was happening, the Millennium Falcon was able to rescue Skywalker from the capital ship, who reached out to Peter Thanas, the head of the Imperial Space Fleet, someone he had grown close to while negotiating and who he recognized through the Force as having a good heart. Thanos decided to disregard the orders of Governor Nuris, and all remaining Imperial ships surrendered to the Rebel Alliance. As a note, the rebels did keep their promise not to overthrow the Empire on the planet. However, the citizens themselves actually organized a revolt, which came to a head during the battle. Nuris is killed, Peter Thanas ends up with Luke's love interest, Gariel Captazin, and the Bakurans become an ally to the New Republic moving forward. All in all, as one of the first serious Star Wars Expanded Universe books, The Truce at Bakura is a pretty fun read, and although this battle is a little strange, and really there's not a lot of firepower there, I find it pretty cool seeing the Alliance and the Empire working together. In Legends, after the defeat of the Empire and of course the loss of Palpatine along with many others at the Battle of Endor, the Empire splintered into almost countless smaller factions. For a better part of a decade, these factions not only fought against the New Republic, but also frequently jostled against each other, fighting over the same resources and area, and each one more or less hoping to become the emergent Imperial faction. Although the title Warlord did actually exist, albeit rarely within the old Empire, it more often refers to the leaders of these splinter factions. Today, we'll be looking at the 5 most powerful of these warlords and thus also the most powerful factions. I'd briefly like to note that Palpatine himself did return from death to lead the Empire's forces in a campaign against the New Republic, which is called Operation Shadow Hand. I won't be considering Palpatine a warlord for the purposes of this list. He more or less had the legal authority of the Empire, and his campaign doesn't really match what we'd expect from an Imperial warlord. Coming in at number 5, we have the Pterodoc brothers, Truton and Tosh. Throughout their lives, the Pterodocs were incredibly intelligent, but like many warlords, very brash and aggressive. Truton, I think, was the more substantial of the two, playing a major role in the formation of the greater Maldruid faction within the Mid-Rim. The Maldruid, however, was an uneasy partnership between the two brothers, and they both had a role to play. Kosh especially helped the partnership by aggressively trying to capture more space. However, for a while after the Battle of Endor, the Maldruid was seriously limited by their position in the galaxy. They were sandwiched under the territory of Warlord ZSINJ, who was extraordinarily powerful. Although ZSINJ wasn't particularly aggressive with other Imperial factions, it limited the degree to which they could expand through the galactic north. The heart of the Maldruid was the Crimson Command, which, after the death of Admiral Thrawn, was led by Admiral Pelion. At its height, the Crimson Command was comprised of over 100 Victory-class Star Destroyers, although those were eventually whittled down. The Maldruid was seriously weakened by Operation Shadow Hand, where they heavily invested in the Empire's resurgence. They lost many ships, their territory was split, and this would represent the beginning of the end. Pterodoc was eventually assassinated at the Imperial Reunification Conference by Admiral Natasi Dalla, and after the events at Toss Beacon, the Maldruid ceased being a separate sovereign entity. At number 4, we have Warlord Artus Kane. Kane consolidated power as the Pentastar Alignment. The alignment was a relatively small but compact and efficient faction. The most notable thing about Kane was how distinct he was from other warlords. Rather than being aggressive and territorial, he was anti-expansionist, instead hoping to return a purified form of the Empire to his small portion of space. Besides for the Reborn Emperor, the Pentastar Alignment was probably the faction which made the most heavy use of the dark side. Notably, Jarek, the Dark Jedi and former Inquisitor of the Empire, was, for a time at least, aligned with the Pentastar Alignment, bringing with him many of the Empire's former Dark Jedi and Inquisitors. The Pentastar Alignment had substantial military assets. Besides for their Vengeance-class Super Star Destroyer, they also made use of the Reaper, Executor-class SST. Nonetheless, Kane refused to help Thrawn during his reemergence, but did heed the call of Emperor Palpatine. Kane would die during Operation Shadow Hand, and after that, the Pentastar Alignment would flounder until being consumed by the Imperial Remnant. At number 3, we have Warlord ZSINJ, who, in my opinion, is the most powerful of the pure Imperial warlords based on territory and assets. assets. ZSINJ was extremely successful in the first few years after the Battle of Endor. Until his death and the return of Thrawn a year later, I would say that he was probably the second largest force in the Star Wars galaxy. He was intelligent, but at times also ruthless and reckless, carving out a large degree of space. He left the other warlords alone most of the time, probably because their empires were significantly smaller, but frequently fought against the New Republic. ZSINJ even struck against a New Republic-controlled Kuat, one of their most heavily defended planets, and is most well known, I'd say, for his rivalry with Rogue Squadron. ZSINJ and his empire really represents the first almost legitimate government on this list. However, he and his dreadnought, the Iron Fist, were eventually destroyed by a combined Hapes Consortium New Republic fleet over the planet Dathomir, with one of his other rivals, Han Solo, firing one of the final shots. At number 2, we have Grand Admiral Thrawn. Thrawn was by far the most intelligent and well-organized of the Imperial Warlords. His focus was on consolidating power, which he did through several strategies. He found and secured a good portion of the Dark Fleet. He assumed what I would call a righteous and legitimate command, with other warlords happily donating their forces to his control. His sheer competence saw a unification which was only matched by the re-emergence of Palpatine. He also actively built new ships and formed a plan to steal New Republic assets from the shipyards of Sluis Von, although the latter was unsuccessful. Thrawn led what seemed to be an untouchable partnership with Jorus C'baoth, who was the clone of a fallen Jedi Master. The two of them, through the use of C'baoth's force abilities, the new ships they captured from the Dark Fleet, and Thrawn's unmatched tactical genius, captured a good portion of Republic space, with countless planets falling to his control either willingly or unwillingly. After seriously weakening New Republic High Command, Thrawn planned a final confrontation at the planet of Bilbringi. The New Republic sprung his trap, and even with the combined forces of the Republic Fleet and the Smugglers Alliance as led by Talon Karrde, Thrawn was poised to strike a death blow against the New Republic. However, he was, at the last minute, assassinated by his bodyguard Rook, and without his leadership, his forces fell into disorganization and the New Republic won the battle. Thrawn, as a warlord, was by far the closest to defeating the New Republic, and in my opinion, his power and his combined forces were second to only the number 1 faction on this list. Before we get there, however, I'd like to take 1 second to note Izani Isard. Isard was arguably the last of the legitimate Imperial leaders, although even she assumed power by assassinating the Imperial Ruling Council, which was formed after power was removed from Sate Pestage. Isard was known for being the last Imperial leader to control Coruscant and for having in her possession the Super Star Destroyer / prison known as the Lusankya. She would cede a poisoned Coruscant to Rogue Squadron, retreating to Typhera, where she was subsequently defeated. After that, she never really managed to control the same degree of power as the other warlords on this list. 2 individuals share the number 1 spot on this list, Natasi Dalla and Admiral Pelion. Dalla and Pelion were, I think, the most powerful of anyone on this list, but also represented an end to the era of Imperial warlords. I've already talked about Pelion. He was second in command to Thrawn and also served as the leader of the Crimson Command for the Greater Maldred, although at that point his heart wasn't really into it. Dalla, though, really came out of nowhere. She commanded a small fleet which protected the Maw research installation and was totally absent and isolated from the Galactic Civil War. She developed a serious hatred towards the New Republic, feelings which were only worsened by the stealing and eventual destruction of the Sun Crusher, as well as most of her fleet. Dalla didn't only hate the New Republic, but she totally despised the pointless bickering between various Imperial warlords, thinking that their best course of action would be to unify so they could successfully fight off the Rebel Alliance together. This was all brought to a head as she visited Blitzer Harsk, who led a small remnant faction known as the Zero Command, which during her visit was attacked by the Crimson Command of the Greater Maldred. She managed to force a ceasefire between the two factions and would later organize a conference of a dozen major warlords at the time at Toss Beacon. Although she did hope to unify the various factions, throughout the meeting it became clear that this was impossible. After allying herself with Pelion, she would assassinate all other warlord leaders, then successfully moving to seize all of their assets, including not only their ships, but also their planets and territories. territory. This gave her control of not only the dredges of the Pentastar alignment in the Greater Maldred, but also countless other factions which had carved out territory in the power vacuum left by the deaths of Thrawn and the Reborn Emperor. After a failed attack on Luke's Jedi Praxium at Yavin and the loss of her Nighthammer Super Star Destroyer, Dala relinquished command of the unified forces to Admiral Pelion, who would go on to form and lead the Imperial Remnant. The Remnant would continue to seize and secure assets, moving away from the core of the galaxy to the Outer Rim, where they would establish a full-scale government. With at least 3 new Super Star Destroyers, the Dominion, the Megador, and the Reaper, the Remnant would fight against the New Republic for some time. The Remnant was helped by the fact that the Empire, for the first time in a long time, actually had a stable region in the Outer Rim, where they could not only hoard assets, but create new ones. The New Republic at this time was also gaining power, so in an effort to preserve the last bit of the former Empire's glory, he signed the Bastion Accord, which ended formal fighting between the two factions. As I mentioned, this represented the end of an era, not only the Imperial Civil War, but also the greater fight between the Empire and the Republic/Rebel Alliance. Open hostilities really ceased at this point, and the two factions would not only fight together, but join together during the Yuuzhan Vong War. ZSINJ was the most infamous of the post-Endor Imperial Warlords. After the fracturing of the Empire, ZSINJ very quickly established his own government, powered by his Super Star Destroyer, the Iron Fist, and its strong supporting fleet. For a time, ZSINJ's empire was the second most powerful, active and unified faction in the galaxy, representing a huge threat to the New Republic. In 7 ABY, after a series of attacks on the New Republic, a fleet was established with a singular task: hunting and killing the rogue Warlord. Leading the fleet was perhaps a surprising character, hero of the rebellion Han Solo. Today's video is interesting and sets the groundwork for the New Republic's conflict against ZSINJ by specifically covering the fleet under Han Solo's command. And a quote from the book Solo Command gives the basics. His flagship was Remonda, one of the most powerful of the Mon Calamari cruisers, and its pilot complement, led by Wedge Antilles, couldn't be better. Also in this portion of his fleet were Mon Caron, a Mon Cal cruiser of more normal strength, Tadivium, a frigate recently converted from a training ship back to a combat vessel, and Etherhawk, a Marauder-class corvette that was just one restoration job ahead of being dilapidated. And note the key element of that passage. Those ships were a portion of Solo's fleet, and the full force itself was made up of several subgroups, with those ships subgroup 1. I'll expand on that in a second, but let's first take a closer look at the Remonda. If you guys want a full breakdown of that ship, by the way, let me know. However, here are some basics from issue 96 of the Star Wars Fact File. After Endor, the New Republic realized that they needed to upgrade their cruiser level firepower and move towards more heavy power ships to counter Imperial Star Destroyers. More on this tomorrow when I post a breakdown, analysis, and history of the New Republic Navy, but briefly, the first ship to fill this niche before the introduction of the MC-90 was the MC-80B. Compared to other Mon Cal cruisers, the MC-80B had an even stronger hull, augmented shield generators, and more room for fighters. Weaponry was comparable to prior Mon Cal variants, however, because of the better survivability and extra fighters, it was better suited to duking it out with Star Destroyers. The Remonda, which was an MC-80B, was one of the most powerful New Republic ships at the time of its commissioning, perhaps second to only Home 1. It was thus made flagship of the Solo fleet. Han described the second battle group as equally powerful as the first. It included another Mon Calamari cruiser, an Imperial Star Destroyer, a Quasar carrier, and a Nebulon B frigate. I really like the idea of having a dedicated Quasar within this battle group. It helped makes up for the poor complement of the Star Destroyer, which was only using its stock ties. That being said, I disagree with Han's opinion, and I think the first group is clearly the stronger of the two. Remonda is a fabulous vessel, and also had a fighter complement led by Wedge. Alongside the rest of Rogue Squadron, the Remonda also launched Wraith Squadron and had dedicated A-Wing and B-Wing squads, giving it incredible versatility. Basically, the Remonda was sort of like a standard Mon Calamari cruiser and a Quasar fire carrier in one. That being said, I do like the extra versatility you get when you throw a Star Destroyer into a mixed fleet, especially because of the extra firepower. And the fact fact that the Star Destroyer is protected by smaller support ships and excellent starfighters is really a nice benefit. That leads in nicely to the third group, which consisted of 2 Star Destroyers, a Nebulon B frigate, and a CR-90. 2 Star Destroyers have considerably more firepower than 2 Mon Calamari cruisers, and this third group was thus sometimes used as a sort of blunt attack force, useful for targeting a single enemy or group of enemies as the smaller, more versatile groups manage starfighters. This is actually exactly what happened at the Battle of Salagas. As most New Republic ships spread out, the Cyranid and the Allegiance pushed heavily to attack the bulk of ZSINJ's fleet. On a fleet-wide scale, the pattern of 2 cruisers to 2 support ships, or a 1-to-1 large to small ship ratio, is certainly not standard within New Republic naval doctrine. I'd expect to see a ratio of 1 large cruiser to perhaps 4 smaller ships. And this is really my main concern with the fleet. Why not throw in, for example, some smaller corvettes or frigates, especially where ZSINJ's fleet was very TIE fighter heavy? Also, why not include more medium strength cruisers to help bridge the gap between the Nebulon Bs, which are in every group by the way, and the Mon Cal cruisers or Star Destroyers? Something like a Dreadnought class heavy cruiser, I think, would be a nice addition. I also do want to recognize that this collection of forces was fairly substantial for the time of its creation. The New Republic was still relying mostly on former Rebel Alliance ships, so dedicating 3 Star Destroyers really shows the kind of threat that ZSINJ was. Speaking of ZSINJ, after his attack on Kuat, Solo Command was bolstered by the Stellar Web, an interdictor cruiser under the control of the Empire. Remember, ZSINJ was a warlord at this point, while an Imperial remnant formed which still maintained an element of legitimacy. The Empire saw ZSINJ as a threat, and thus the Stellar Web cooperated with the New Republic. An interdictor cruiser certainly adds numerous tactical options, but is also somewhat of a liability in the middle of battle, and needs ships to protect it. The Courtship of Princess Leia is one of the most ridiculous Star Wars Legends books there is. In it, Han Solo kidnaps Leia, bringing her to the planet Dathomir, which he had recently won in a card game. Luke and Leia's suitor, Hapen Prince Isolde, follow and get into some shenanigans, which I'll talk about on another day. The actual battle is started when an Imperial garrison on the planet Dathomir, who had been there for some time, discover the presence of Han Solo and call Warlord ZSINJ. Solo had been in command of a fleet which had harassed ZSINJ across the galaxy, and the 2 men had developed a very serious rivalry. Arriving with his Super Star Destroyer, the Iron Fist, and several regular Imperial Star Destroyers, ZSINJ deployed the Orbital Night Cloak and ordered Dathomir's inhabitants to turn Han over. The Night Cloak, or the Night Cloak satellites, were frankly pretty poor superweapons which surrounded a planet, blocking all heat and energy, basically causing all life on the planet to slowly freeze to death. The system, however, was highly flawed, and even the destruction of a single satellite meant that the whole array would cease to work, and satellites could be easily destroyed even by handheld weapons. So, how did the good guys win? Well, during this whole event, the Hapes Consortium had been engaged in talks with the New Republic at Coruscant. The Hapens were an isolationist people with a strong military. The Honor Fleet, which visited Coruscant, had over 70 ships alone, mostly battle dragons. Before leaving to chase Han and Leia with Luke, Prince Isolde had told the Hapens and the New Republic what happened, and the 2 apparently massed their own fleet and followed. Back on Dathomir, Han and Luke steal back the Falcon, which had been captured by the Empire, and break through the orbital array. Upon reaching space, they are shocked. Hundreds of ships, mostly Hapen battle dragons, were engaged with ZSINJ's fleet. It's unclear whether the New Republic sent their own capital ships as well, but we do know that X-Wings were also engaging Imperial forces. The Hapens were also dropping pulse mass generators, which basically prevented a hyperspace retreat for a short period of time. Sort of like a rudimentary interdiction field. That meant that one way or another, this would be the final battle between Warlord ZSINJ and Han Solo. Knowing that, and that he knew the Warlord better than anyone else, Han takes control of the Falcon from Luke, who, by the way, had been flying the ship and precisely operating the gun turrets through the Force, which is super cool, and accelerated towards the Iron Fist. Han, who again knows how ZSINJ will act, passes through the ship's particle shields and waits until the SSD's tractor beams are aimed at the Falcon. As they're about to lock on, he fires a set of proton torpedoes, which are caught by the tractor beam and end up heavily damaging the Fist. Han then sticks close to the superstructure, fires a second set of missiles at the SSD's command module, crippling the ship and killing ZSINJ. The rest of the New Republic/Hapen fleet then opens up with ion cannons and proton torpedoes, crippling and eventually destroying the ship as the rest of the Imperial fleet surrenders. This was a serious win for the New Republic. Han had been tracking ZSINJ across the galaxy for over 5 months, and at this point in time at least, he was the most dominant warlord by far. Removing the biggest fish resulted in a power vacuum which caused the other smaller warlords to cannibalize each other, and the New Republic was also able to move in and take back hundreds of systems. All in all, the courtship of Princess Leia is a pretty wild book. You have the Hapens, you have the Night Sisters introduced for the first time, you have Warlord ZSINJ, primarily an antagonist of the X-Wing books, killed just randomly, and you have some other weird stuff like Han temporarily being a Prince of Corellia, and just go read it yourself, then let me know what you think. Hey guys, this is Eckhart Slaughter. Hello and welcome to another video, and I think today's content is really interesting because we're talking about a super Star Destroyer which, within the lore, just should not exist, and specifically about Warlord ZSINJ, one of the most famous Imperials of all time, perhaps having access to one of the greatest super Star Destroyer classes to ever exist, the Sovereign type. A super Star Destroyer which was not even completed before his death. How did this happen? How did ZSINJ get access to a ship that wasn't even fully complete before he died? A ship which may have never been fully completed. Well, that's what we'll talk about today. Before we get into the mystery though, I am going to give you guys a little bit of context about the characters and the things that we're discussing, just so it makes sense and so you can understand why it doesn't make sense as well. First off, of course, we have Warlord ZSINJ. Warlord ZSINJ was the most powerful Imperial, arguably, in the years after the Battle of Endor. He was a serious threat to both the Empire and the New Republic. He operated in a large swath of space. He wasn't a hardline Imperial, he was more self-serving, and as I mentioned before his death, he was a serious threat. ZSINJ was killed in the courtship of Princess Leia at the Battle of Dathomir in 8 ABY, which is relatively early on in the post-Endor period, only 4 years after Return of the Jedi. The Sovereign, on the other hand, was a planned class of super Star Destroyer under Palpatine's Dark Empire. The Sovereign was a slightly smaller version of the Eclipse, which was Palpatine's flagship when he was reborn. It was 15 kilometers long, included a miniaturized super laser, and would have easily been one of the most powerful warships in the entire galaxy. We don't really learn much about the Sovereign for reasons that will be evident in just a moment, but we do get some details in the Dark Empire source book, which I'll read for you now. The Sovereign was a less powerful design of the Eclipse class. The Emperor envisioned a fleet of these vessels. The first of the line, still under construction, is the Sovereign. Other potential ships in the line include the Otarch, Despot, and Heresiarch. So yeah, the reason we don't hear about the Sovereign is because, as per that blurb, even by Operation Shadowhand and the final death of Palpatine, no Sovereign, including the lead ship of the class, had finished construction. What's more, it seems like the Sovereign's 3 sister ships were still in planning stages. As far as we know, no Sovereign, including the Sovereign herself, was ever completed. That's why it's a little bit strange that if you, say, look up the Sovereign, the ship itself, on the Star Wars wiki, you'll see that it was used at some point by Warlord ZSINJ, and that doesn't really make sense. ZSINJ died in 8 ABY, as I mentioned. Operation Shadowhand occurred in 10 ABY, and at that point the Sovereign was still under construction, so what's going on here, and what's the source of confusion? I find this to be an interesting discussion point because I like to see how the lore evolves, and in cases like this where it appears that wires have been crossed, it's interesting to try to figure out, well, what happened. So where's the source of ZSINJ having the Sovereign? Well, it's actually the Star Wars Encyclopedia, and for those who don't know, there is a 3-volume Star Wars Encyclopedia which covers pretty much everything, no matter how minor, in the Star Wars Legends. Anyway, if you go to the entry for Sovereign, you'll see that the Sovereign was listed as a super Star Destroyer used by Warlord ZSINJ, with its sister ships being the same 3 we mentioned earlier, the Otarch, Heresiarch, and Despot. The weird thing is, Warlord ZSINJ did have a super Super Star Destroyer. He was very, very well known for his Iron Fist, which was his flagship and which was one of the most visible symbols of power in the post-Endor period. Interestingly enough, the Iron Fist does actually receive an entry in the encyclopedia. It's correctly identified as ZSINJ's Super Star Destroyer. It was originally named the Brawl, etc., etc. So what's going on here? Did ZSINJ have a second Super Star Destroyer? I mean, this wouldn't even be the first time. ZSINJ also tried to acquire and use the Razor's Kiss, which was another Super Star Destroyer. Is it possible the shipyards of Biss were raided and the Sovereign was stolen? I don't really think so. Now, we do actually see something sort of similar happen with the Eclipse being stolen by the Zon Consortium, but there's some major differences, including the fact that even by Operation Shadowhand, the Sovereign was not in a workable state, and the fact that the Eclipse at the time was being built at Kuat, which is much more visible and accessible than Biss, which was essentially secret and very highly fortified, especially in this era. I mean, ZSINJ stealing the ship would help explain why it wasn't ready before the Eclipse, despite being smaller and probably easier to construct, but I think much more likely there was a miscommunication somewhere along the line that led to this, and I actually may have discovered the reason why when listening to a Star Wars audiobook. So, the end of Courtship of Princess Leia sees Han Solo take down the Iron Fist in a very cool moment. It's pretty iconic, and of course, it ends the threat of Warlord ZSINJ, although that's an interesting discussion too, because that's actually ZSINJ's first appearance, then his backstory was sort of added later for Wraith Squadron, but whatever. However, if you listen to the audiobook, Warlord ZSINJ is not in the Iron Fist. He's in a different Super Star Destroyer called the Sovereign. Now, the Sovereign in that book is not a Sovereign class. It's just another Executor or some other ship. It doesn't have a super laser or anything like that. It's not described as being an unknown vessel. Sovereign is just its name, and I'm going to play a brief clip from the audiobook for you guys to listen to so you know that I'm just not making things up.
This is General Han Solo. Han nudged the stick and the Falcon rose toward the forward command module of the Sovereign. Look up at your view screen, you vermin. Kiss my Wookiee.
So that's interesting, and I'm wondering what happened. Is it possible the audiobook was based off an earlier edition of The Courtship of Princess Leia? I actually don't have a first edition of the book, so I'm not sure if maybe in that first edition the super ship was called the Sovereign, or if the audiobook was based off a version of the script before that edit was put in. Maybe the ship was just changed names for whatever reason, but this is almost certainly the source of the confusion within the Star Wars encyclopedia, because we also know from the Courtship of Princess Leia specifically that ZSINJ did not have the manpower or the resources to actually crew 2 Super Star Destroyers. That's a bit of lore we get within the book itself. I don't know how they put together the encyclopedia. It's just an incredible achievement because of detail, but I assume that somewhere, whether they were just going through old text files or something, they based the Sovereign entry off an old script for the Courtship of Princess Leia, and then the Iron Fist off something more recent. So there was a bit of crossover there, especially where the Iron Fist also appeared in other works like The Essential Guide to Warfare and whatever not, whereas the Sovereign also has information from the Dark Empire sourcebook. They're both sort of combined to make a ship which exists but also at the same time doesn't. So did ZSINJ have an experimental Super Star Destroyer that never actually saw active service? No, it was a simple editing mistake, but an interesting one at that, and I'd really love to know how was the encyclopedia put together, because there's just so much detail, there are so many entries, it's really incredible. In Legends, after Endor, the Empire fractured across the galaxy, and most of the Empire's military losses during this period actually came from infighting, rather than the rebels and later the New Republic. Endor is sort of a microcosm of this. Death Squadron and the rest of the Star Destroyers, which had been attempting to protect the Death Star, were left leaderless after the destruction of the Executor. Under the leadership of Captain Pellaeon, they decided to retreat, but afterwards could not come to a consensus about next moves. That is because Palpatine designed the Empire such that it would only answer to him. There was no second in command, there was no Empress or Emperor after him, and there was no line of succession. So, the many powerful voices across the galaxy, which had been kept in line by Palpatine, basically decided to do their own thing, and we have warlords like ZSINJ, the Pterodoc brothers, Artus Cain, and more emerge. Some of them were honestly trying to continue the Empire. Others, like ZSINJ, however, were more interested in making a state belonging to them. Thus, many of these Imperial subgroups rubbed against each other, resulting in many civil wars which saw the destruction of much of the Empire's navy. It was so bad that the Empire even tried to help the New Republic kill Warlord ZSINJ. After that point, the New Republic became more powerful and started to win military victories across the galaxy, eventually defeating various warlords, including Thrawn. At that point, we see Operation Shadow Hand, where the Empire again unified under Palpatine. However, that event also brought the Imperial Mutiny, which saw perhaps thousands of ships destroyed as they tore themselves apart, under the influence of Darth Sidious, who was attempting to cull the weak from his military. Making matters worse is the fact, of course, that the New Republic repelled the Empire during Operation Shadow Hand. They destroyed Biss, probably hundreds of ships around Biss, and killed many important leaders. The Empire would make various other missteps which would result in large ship losses, including Daala's attack on the Jedi Praxium and the ORINDA campaign. Between all of those, many ships were lost, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Another major aspect of the Imperial Star Destroyers' post-Endor career was its introduction into the New Republic. Now, at first, this came as you'd expect. Even at the Battle of Endor, the New Republic stole several Star Destroyers, but they didn't stop there. The Star Destroyer actually became an integral part of the New Republic fleet. Although particularly in its later years, the Star Destroyer was somewhat old, ships honestly weren't often made like it anymore, and it offered an incredible amount of firepower. So whenever possible, the New Republic captured ships, from major battles like that of Coruscant, to increasingly engagements against a single ship. As the Imperial Navy fractured, there were more cases where the New Republic could jump on an unescorted Star Destroyer. Even by a couple of years after Endor, Princess Leia was using a captured Imperial Star Destroyer, the Rebel Dream, as her flagship, which is somewhat ironic because that ship, initially named the Tyrant, actually served in Death Squadron and participated at the Battle of Endor, though it was captured afterwards. And it wasn't just the New Republic that was capturing ships during this era. The Hapan Navy, for example, in the courtship of Princess Leia, is said to have dozens of captured Imperial Star Destroyers within their fleet. We also see the Black Fleet, which was captured and used by the Vathan Duskon League, which had at least 44 ships, most Star Destroyer sized or above. Now, I've done an entire video on the history of the New Republic Navy, so I'm not going to duplicate that here, but suffice it to say that captured Imperial Star Destroyers became a crucial part of the war effort. This was especially early on, before the New Republic had true warships like the MC-90, but even afterwards, Star Destroyer class ships, whether made by the New Republic or captured, anchored the majority of the large fleets across the galaxy. Even by the Yuuzhan Vong War, the first actual engagement by the New Republic against the Yuuzhan Vong was led by a Star Destroyer. It was during this conflict as well that the New Republic began highly modifying and perhaps even creating their own ISDs. We have, for example, the Elagos Akla, which, alongside the Mon Mothma, was an ISD with hidden gravity well projectors. The later Anakin Solo was a very highly modified ship which used long-range turbo lasers, special paint, and a variety of unique features. These are typically referred to nonetheless as Imperial Star Destroyers, so it's unclear to me whether they were modified ships or newly built Star Destroyers. However, we do know that during this time, the Empire, and they had been since Endor, was continually pumping out new Star Destroyers, although their industrial capacity was seriously diminished after Operation Shadow Hand and after they left the Deep Core for the Outer Rim. The Empire also eventually shifted production away from Imperial Star Destroyers to newer models like the Turbulent class, which just generally were much more efficient. The New Republic did the same. They built ships like the Republic Star Destroyer and the Nebula, generally preferring flexibility as exemplified by the 5th Fleet. By this point too, the New Republic had transitioned into the Galactic Alliance, and it too was still using Star Destroyers within its fleet, and it would be rare for a major battle not to have one on probably either side. And that represents the majority of ISDs. Most were destroyed, captured, or refitted into other vessels, We also, however, have the case of the Errant Venture, a Star Destroyer initially captured by the New Republic, but surrendered to smuggler Booster Tarek. It was painted red and operated, depending on the circumstances, for the New Republic, or as a private casino or marketplace. It seems like by the late Legacy era, however, Star Destroyers, at least of the Imperial variety, had fallen out of use, probably just due to their age, not fitting well within the modern naval doctrines, and the fact that the initial supply was probably close to running out. Let's now move on to canon, and without an essential guide to warfare or other major reference book detailing the post-Endor era, there's certainly a lot less to talk about here. We do know that many Star Destroyers were squirreled away by various Imperial factions after Endor. Notably, Gallius Rax had thousands of ships hidden in nebulas, some of which later went on to fight and die at the Battle of Jakku, but others which rendezvoused in the unknown regions and went on to form the First Order. Before Jakku, the New Republic was actually doing a really good job at isolating Star Destroyers and small fleets, hunting them down, destroying them with overwhelming numbers, and by the Battle of Jakku, only a year after Endor, the fleet had really dwindled. Still, a fairly significant portion of the Navy did remain, known to some within the New Republic Senate, and although powered by resurgent Star Destroyers, the First Order did still use ISDs in their fleet. But of course, that's not all. We've seen in the promotional material for The Rise of Skywalker that in a Dark Empire-esque move, Palpatine as well was building a secret fleet of what appear to be older Imperial 1 class Star Destroyers only, indicating that the majority of that may have been done before the Battle of Endor. Whether that will initially stand against the First Order, join the First Order, is unclear to me at least. Also worth noting is the New Republic Starhawk program. Starhawks were a New Republic ship made out of captured and disassembled Imperial Star Destroyers. They were cutting edge, very powerful, and I think make a lot of sense within New Republic naval doctrine. The New Republic didn't have that many officers and personnel to man their ships, so something inefficient but powerful like a Star Destroyer fell instead to something very expensive but very powerful and efficient like the Starhawk. A trio of these ships was largely responsible for killing one of the Empire's last Super Star Destroyers, the Ravager, at the Battle of Jakku. And that I think is a good history of what happened to the Empire's 25,000 Star Destroyers after the Battle of Endor in both canon and legends. The New Republic's campaign against the Empire at Kuat Drive Yards was long, it was bloody, and it wasn't very elegant. The Empire, who used the station to provide a large portion of their Star Destroyers and other military assets, likely dedicated dozens, if not hundreds of capital ships to its defense. For the first few days of battle, the Empire and the New Republic basically just threw their forces against each other. The Empire had a strong protective line because even a little bit of damage to the station would be devastating, while the New Republic used their capital ships and especially their B-Wing heavy bombers to try to take down Star Destroyers. Ships, pilots, and resources were slowly being whittled down on each side, but it was not clear, early on at least, which side would outlast the other. New Republic leadership, who felt like they couldn't overcome the many Star Destroyers in a traditional matchup, switched their strategy. Instead of trying to actually take down the defending Imperial fleet, a small group of starfighters made up mostly of B-Wings, which would inflict the damage, and X-Wings, who would provide cover, were sent on a mission to try to inflict as much damage against the ring itself as possible. As this attack was launched, the New Republic fleet also attacked a specific portion of the Imperial's forces, taking some heat off the starfighters. However, Kuat had its own defenses. Besides her turbo laser emplacements and fighter hangars, elevators from within the shipyard itself also brought AT-ATs, AT-TEs, and other walker models to the ring's surface. The starfighters had been targeting an important monorail, but they were forced to use their torpedoes and munitions against the various walkers. Neither they or their escort X-Wings possessed laser cannons powerful enough to incapacitate the station's defenses. Thus, the first campaign would ultimately result in failure. Although the ring would crack in several places, the starfighters were forced to retreat. The Empire only suffered minor losses, some structural damage to the shipyards, and a few of their walkers were destroyed, but shipbuilding capacity wasn't reduced in any meaningful way. The battle would continue on for weeks after this, with starfighters again launching critical attacks against Kuat, but the Imperial lines still holding. On one occasion, the New Republic baited a portion of the defense fleet far out of position, and Blade Squadron, again protected by X-Wings, was able to disable a large hangar, destroying many unlaunched TIE fighters, and also weakening the Empire's ability to respond quickly to fighter threats. After every successful mission or attack, the New Republic flotilla would pull back, restock fighters, allow pilots to sleep, before launching another raid. Unfortunately for the Empire, their forces were being whittled down. They were not able to press the attack themselves because of fear of leaving the ring exposed, and reinforcements were hardly ever brought in, if at all. What's more, the New Republic could attack in waves, attack when it was convenient for them, and really just dictate the pace of the campaign. After several weeks of this, both forces were completely exhausted. The campaign ended with both sides dropping all pretenses, launching all of their fighters, and charging headfirst into battle. This would be very short-lived, however, as the Empire would soon surrender. We don't get any specific details in either Blade Squadron Kuat or the Aftermath trilogy about why the surrender actually happened, but I have some theories. First of all, New Republic starfighters were far superior to anything fielded by the Empire. Most notably, New Republic ships are armed with shields, while TIE fighters are not. I think that a lot of time, if a strike failed for the New Republic, they were still able to retreat with most of their fighters intact. A B-Wing or an X-Wing, for example, even if shot by a laser, should be able to limp back to base and get fully repaired. By the end of the battle, however, the Empire was resorting to using shuttles. That's how short on fighters they were. We also see in the final engagement that Blade Squadron targets an enemy capital ship and takes it down very easily. The presence of these heavy bombers and the slow decline of Imperial forces likely made the fact that this would be a loss fairly evident. The Empire was also largely demoralized even by this point and was seeing losses across the galaxy. It's very possible that both the local Moff and the head of Kuat just didn't see any future moving forward for the Empire. To summarize though, this was a long campaign focused on attrition, with neither side really scoring a killing blow against the other. I think the New Republic won because they were more successful in the individual strategies they used, and because they also had the advantage of being able to dictate the pace of battle throughout the campaign. In 6 ABY, the New Republic set its sights on recapturing Coruscant, a battle we actually covered a few days ago. After covertly landing on the planet, along with the rest of Rogue Squadron, Wedge Antilles was assigned with assessing the loyalty of Coruscant citizens. This was obviously a difficult task. How do you assess the zeitgeist of trillions of people? However, one way he planned to do so was by visiting the various Imperial facilities on the planet which were open to the populace, and conducting a sort of survey. This was his thought process. By learning what it was the Empire wanted its citizens to believe about the rebellion, he could then assess whether or not Imperial propaganda efforts were successful. One of the main locations they surveyed was the Galactic Museum, which provided a fascinating insight into the Imperial propaganda machine. So, the first 2 floors were designed to impress visitors with their magnificence, to show off the wealth of the Empire, and also lend some authority to the propaganda that the later floors would be spreading, including one that was entirely dedicated to the life of the Emperor, with holographic representations of people he knew singing his praises. However, it was the final area of that floor which really drove the propaganda home. It showed an image of the Emperor lying on a platform. However, he was not evil or disfigured as Sidious was by the time of his death, not oozing with evil and moral rot as Luke had described him, but rather young and more handsome. This is something we've also seen in Star Wars Rebels. The image was accompanied by a hologram of Vader, which stated, and I quote, "Behold my master and weep. He has been stolen from us by those who embrace hatred." The Emperor learned that the rebels had stolen plans for an Imperial planetary ore extractor and intended to use the one they were fabricating at Endor on inhabited planets. He assembled his fleet, and heedless of personal danger, he had me take him to Endor. He infiltrated the half-completed extractor, offering these rebels his forgiveness and a hand in friendship. They rejected him and attacked his fleet. My master had no alternative but to destroy this Death Star himself, perishing in the process so his citizens could live on. I was slain with him, but my death did not distress me, for it came in service to my master. Now obviously this is a complete fabrication of the truth. It basically says that Palpatine traveled to Endor to infiltrate the Death Star, which was being constructed by the Rebel Alliance with the purpose of destroying a planet. I do find this somewhat strange, as we know the Tarkin doctrine sort of encouraged ruling through fear and euphemizing the Death Star as an ore extractor sort of neuters its purpose somewhat. But anyway, as Vader was speaking, a falsified Battle of Endor is shown, which has a small Imperial fleet outgunned by a massive rebel formation. The Empire fights back valiantly, pierces to the heart of the rebel fleet, but is overwhelmed. It then shows Palpatine, full of sorrow, regret, and sadness, destroying the battle station in a triumphant last stand, also taking out nearly the entire rebel fleet. Other floors in the museum were dedicated to the social and cultural developments of the Empire, or displays of the fauna and flora of the galaxy, even a repository of Sith artifacts. Unsurprisingly, even these floors were propaganda pieces. Native animals were said to have been made extinct by outlaws and malcontents, including Ewoks, who were made to look as cute as possible. So, was this propaganda successful? Well, even Wedge during his tour said the following. The whole presentation had sent a shiver down his spine. He had been at Endor. He had fired the shot that had helped destroy the Death Star. Yet, this telling of the story felt as compelling to him as the true history of what had happened. It suggested a benign purpose for the Death Stars, and made the rebels out to be monsters for thinking to use one on an inhabited planet. By doing so, and suggesting the Emperor had gone there to prevent that sort of perversion, the fear that lingered in everyone's heart concerning the destruction of Alderaan was shifted into fear directed at the rebellion. However, Wedge also acknowledges that the rebel fleet being demolished obviously is out of sync with reality, and that's the case largely. The Empire can talk the talk, but most of the time they choose not to walk the walk. Or otherwise, they don't have evidence to support their claims. And that's why it's almost certain that this propaganda was somewhat effective throughout the fairly prosperous and less held down core worlds, but outside of that, where the Empire was more brutal, there's probably neither the resources or even possibility of keeping people so indoctrinated. As the rebels eventually invaded the planet, many citizens actually fled Coruscant. Not only Imperial war criminals, but just random people. And this does indicate that the propaganda was at least somewhat successful. Corran was certain that the vast majority of people heading out firmly believed that the rebels would steal their wealth, dispossess them of their treasures, defile their sons and daughters, torture, maim, and kill resistors, and commit any number of other crimes against them. He didn't think plunder and raping were foremost in the minds of most rebels, but here at the core of the Empire, the beliefs and lies used by the Emperor to justify his dictatorship ran deep among some folk. Another thing to note is that the Galactic Museum had existed for over 10,000 years as a legitimate institution before being perverted by the Empire. There was thus a stable foundation and a degree of credibility associated with the lies spread by the Empire. The most well-known Executor Super Star Destroyer is the ship which bears the class name, the Executor herself, flagship of Darth Vader and Death Squadron before its destruction at Endor. However, the dreadnought which would ultimately have a greater impact on galactic affairs is the Executor's sister ship, originally called the Executor II before being renamed the Lusankya. Both vessels were actually constructed at the same time at Fondor shipyards, but while the Executor would become a symbol of Imperial power, the Lusankya was covertly buried under Coruscant's planet-spanning city, saved for an unknown purpose, perhaps as a contingency plan should the Alliance attack Imperial Center, perhaps to hide the sheer degree of Palpatine's military investments. But let's spend some time talking about the history of the ship. And before I get into this section, if you haven't already, I highly recommend that you guys read at least the first 4 X-Wing novels. If you haven't, maybe do so before watching this video, because we'll be getting seriously into spoiler territory, and the books are phenomenal. Anyway, in the first months after the death of Palpatine and the fracturing of the Empire, former Director of Imperial Intelligence Izani Isar consolidated power, eliminating the Imperial Ruling Council, including Sate Pestage, and setting up shop out of Coruscant. One of her greatest assets was the Lusankya, which she had been gifted by Palpatine before his death, likely partially due to the two's romantic connection. The Lusankya, as well as some of her other assets, made her one of the most powerful early Imperial warlords. As the New Republic campaigned against the Empire, rumors of a top-secret Imperial research station called Lusankya emerged. Captured New Republic agents were terribly tortured and, worst of all, brainwashed into undercover agents of the Empire, activated as spies, assassins, or suicide attackers. The New Republic knew nothing about the Lusankya. They had no idea that it was a Super Star Destroyer, they didn't know that it was stationed on Coruscant, they just knew that it was perhaps the most feared Imperial reconditioning center in the entire galaxy. Some of the more notable figures imprisoned on the Lusankya during this period were Rebel hero Yon Dodonna, Rogue Squadron pilot Tycho Selku, and, most importantly, Corran Horn. Eventually, Coruscant was targeted by the New Republic, who was lured into battle by Isard, who left the planet undefended but poisoned with the Krytos virus. However, even after recapture, Isard and the Lusankya remained on-world, hidden from the New Republic. During the planet's liberation, Corran Horn is actually captured by the Empire and brought to the prison ship. Corran, upon waking up, believes he is on a different planet in some far-off facility, but eventually discovers that he is inside a Star Destroyer which has used gravity manipulators as well as just some pure physical disguises to make it look like the inside of a cave or an old mining facility. Corran manages to escape, discovering the truth of the Dreadnought. Knowing the New Republic would surely strike, Isard is forced into action, and in an iconic scene, the Lusankya bursts from the surface of Coruscant, blasting through the local planetary shield and jumping to hyperspace, killing millions in the process. Isard would then take her ship to Typhera, where she would attempt to re-establish her rule. I can cover exactly what happens next in a full battle breakdown, however, the basics are that the Lusankya is stripped of its support ships by some Rogue Squadron trickery, then attacked by a New Republic fleet, supported by captured Star Destroyers and civilian freighters armed with repurposed torpedo launchers. Overwhelmed, the crew of the Lusankya surrenders, and the damaged ship is brought under control of the New Republic. For nearly half a decade, the captured Super Star Destroyer sees almost no action, which I find to be very surprising, considering the Lusankya obviously could have been useful during the Dark Empire attack or Thrawn's campaign. However, it was notably reactivated for the ORINDA campaign, which I've covered extensively in a prior video. In short form, the Lusankya, as well as another captured Super Star Destroyer, the Guardian, helped put one of the final nails in the Imperial Remnant's coffin. The old girl then helped blunt the Vong invasion and took a center role in the defense of Borlias. However, the Vong invasion took its toll on the Lusankya, and the ship was deemed too damaged to continue fighting. The Dreadnought was stripped down for parts. However, instead of being junked, it was given one final mission. The New Republic spread word and feigned the creation of a superweapon, the Star Lancer project. This drew Vong forces to Borlias, including a rare, fully militarized world ship. Knowing they were coming, the New Republic loaded the Lusankya with explosives, and Operation Emperor's Spear, an incredibly apt name, saw the Dreadnought ram the Vong Corostrona, resulting in the destruction of the two ships and a serious blow to the Vong. Thus ends the proud service of the Super Star Destroyer, engaging in a final act which benefited both of its formal factions. The Lusankya saw the rise and the fall of the New Republic, the death of countless Imperial warlords, the New Republic and the Vong's capture of Coruscant, and really everything in between, often while only working with half a crew or mostly in disrepair. The history of the Lusankya was an interesting one, as is the fact that it was outfitted slightly differently than a standard Imperial Super Star Destroyer, with some point defense cannons replacing heavy turbo lasers. Honestly, I think that's a good trade-off. Although, in Return of the Jedi, we see the citizens of Coruscant seemingly revolting against the Empire shortly after the Battle of Endor, the planet would not be fully liberated until nearly 3 years later. By 7 ABY, Coruscant would become the new capital for the New Republic, and of course the center, again, of the entire galaxy. But only a few months earlier, towards the end of 6 ABY, Izani Isard, having killed most of the Imperial Ruling Council, was still held up on Imperial Center, which was protected by strong planetary defenses. As the New Republic battled to capture the hearts, minds, and of course planets of the galaxy, they made the securing of Coruscant, or as was often known during the era, Imperial Center, an absolute priority, even above fighting off Imperial warlords, So the New Republic pushed towards the core, they established bases, and covert agents were also sent to Coruscant to gauge planetary defenses. However, it was made obvious that the New Republic would not be able to assault Coruscant directly. Their naval force just wasn't large enough, and Coruscant was too well defended. We get the following quote from Wedge's Gamble, Book 2 of the X-Wing series. "To take Coruscant, we must eliminate the shields. There are a number of ways to do this, but none of them are simple. A direct assault would cost us more dearly than both Death Star battles combined." This was because, as Admiral Akbar explained, the Golan defense platforms and especially the planetary shield made it so Coruscant could hold out, even without a navy. And speaking of, the actual space forces around the planet were paltry, only perhaps a few Star Destroyers. But obviously Coruscant did have one of the strongest planetary shields in the entire galaxy, so just bombarding it didn't seem practical. One option was to blockade the planet, but that just didn't seem practical, as it would leave the New Republic fleet in a single position for too long, and it would also give Isar the time to summon reinforcements, perhaps even Super Star Destroyers. So another plan was developed, which saw Rogue Squadron inserted incognito to the planet's surface alongside several criminals who had been negotiated from the prisons of Kessel, basically to start trouble. Their goal was to take down the planet's defensive systems from within. Now, as a note, there was a degree of internal strife within the team, mostly surrounding Tycho Selku, who had been abducted and taken to Isard's Lusankya prison sometime earlier, which was known for brainwashing individuals and re-embedding them to their faction, only to have them turn on their allies. So that made all of this a bit more difficult. So initial plans were discussed for how to take down the planetary shield. I'm going to talk about that a different day, especially Wedge's trip to the Galactic Museum. But for right now, it's simple enough to say that the first plan was to take down the shields through Coruscant's computer systems. However, that was determined to be a non-viable plan. The second plan was far more convoluted, but is the one the New Republic ended up going with. So there are 3 pieces of background information that are crucial to understanding Rogue Squadron's plan. First of all, the Coruscant planetary shield received its power from planet-side generators. Obviously, the Coruscant electrical system was extraordinarily sophisticated. However, there were enough critical components within a single proximate area that it was not infallible, especially to terrorism or some sort of attack. Second, Coruscant was weather controlled, primarily through large orbital mirrors, which reflected the light of the system's sun. These could be moved and operated to strategically distribute energy. Third, the cityscape of Coruscant was constantly changing, and one of the ways this was accomplished was through the use of large constructor droids. Constructor droids were basically multi-story bulldozers. They would take down buildings and use the material to create new ones, depending on the needs of the planet. So Rogue Squadron's plan was 3-pronged, and again, this is fairly insane. The first team, led by Wedge Antilles, was sent to capture one of the Imperial constructor droids. The second team, led by Corran Horn, was to protect the droid from the air, and they were armed with headhunters. Wedge was to alter the course of the droid, moving it towards one of the orbital mirror stations. It was known that Imperial procedure would dictate that the station be evacuated, at which point the third team, including Winter, Tycho Selku, and the Gand Oral, would infiltrate the station and take control of the planet's orbital mirrors. So the plan basically goes off without a hitch. The Empire does eventually realize what's going on and dispatches TIE fighters, as well as defenses from Coruscant's buildings. The Walker is defended by Team 2, and Team 3 manages to infiltrate the station. We get a nice perspective from the cousin of Captain Nita, who is the commanding officer on the mirror platform, as the station repositions to direct immense amounts of energy onto Coruscant's surface. This causes massive storms. Unfortunately, the storms themselves, while capable of destroying much of the infrastructure essential to keeping the shields up, does not manage to totally destroy everything. Thus, one of Rogue Squadron's best pilots, Corran Horn, is sent not only to destroy the final relay station, but to do so, and I quote Wedge here, while outrunning lightning. Corran manages not only to hit the station with 2 missiles, but with the help of Rogue Squadron, also rams a TIE interceptor into the target. The attack is successful, Coruscant loses power, and the shields fall. This is, of course, only one aspect of the battle. As Wedge launched his assault, the New Republic fleet was jumping from a nearby star system towards Coruscant. An interdictor cruiser was placed between the jump point and Coruscant, so the ships could be pulled out of hyperspace should the shields not be disabled in time. Rogue Squadron accomplished their goal with only 10 seconds or so remaining before the cutoff point, and the fleet proceeded. Here we get another quote from Lieutenant Nita. His ability to recognize the two ships, two Star Destroyers that had just jumped in, pleased him, which is why he wondered about the underlying sense of unease slowly creeping into his heart. About the time one of the long, gently curved Mon Calamari battlecruisers reverted and swung into the line, he recalled the Accuser and Adjudicator had both been captured at Endor by the Rebels. More and more Rebel ships poured from hyperspace, big ships, small ships, snub fighters, freighters, frigates, and corvettes, each of them pulled into line with the heavier ships. The battlecruisers and destroyers formed a central layer, with ships diminishing in size and strength as they stretched from equator to pole in the northern hemisphere. So with the shield down, the Empire only had 2 Victory Star Destroyers and a set of goal and defense platforms protecting the planet. The Victories intercepted as much firepower as they could, while the Golan 3s pounded away at the Rebel fleet, destroying numerous smaller ships. Thankfully, Rogue Squadron on the ground still had control of the orbital mirror and used it to destroy a key defense platform. This allowed the fleet to move in and attack the 2 Victories directly. The 2 New Republic Star Destroyers and the Home One split the Victories down the middle and hit them with broadsides, while the MarMarBunbun and MC-80B cut in front of them, also firing broadsides. Smaller ships and other cruisers both continued to overwhelm the Star Destroyers and also spread out to prepare and watch for possible reinforcements. However, the battle was beyond ended at this point, and due to overwhelming force, both Star Destroyers actually surrendered and were added to the New Republic fleet, a great victory. From that point, the ground invasion began. First, a strike team was sent to take out some of the Imperial sensors and communication equipment, which would make the invasion difficult. Then larger forces were landed. Unfortunately, after crashing his headhunter, Corran Horn was presumed dead, though was actually captured by and aboard the Lusankya. Also unfortunate though is the fact that Izani Isard realized she couldn't hold Coruscant forever and was fully prepared to cede it to the New Republic. However, she did so after poisoning it with the Krytos virus, an illness which affects primarily non-humans. She would later escape in the Lusankya itself in one of the craziest Star Wars Legends moments of all time, which I've covered in a previous video. In 9 ABY, the New Republic was in the midst of facing their first great threat, the re-emergence of Grand Admiral Thrawn. Thrawn had reunited and was now leading Imperial forces with exceptional competency, unifying several major warlords and quickly recapturing territory. The first few months of the conflict saw several major New Republic losses, with only a few wins. However, notably, famed rebellion figure Garm Bel Iblis had returned to action and was now stationed on Coruscant. Facilitating Thrawn's rampage across the galaxy was the clone of Dark Jedi Jorah Sabayoth, who was using his force powers to coordinate Imperial forces. However, the relationship between Thrawn and Sabayoth was very difficult at best, with the crazed Dark Jedi more interested in capturing and converting the Solo children rather than reinstating Imperial rule. This came to a head after a failed kidnapping of the newborn twins on Coruscant, and the 2 men agreed that the most pressing immediate goal was the removal of the New Republic. Sabayoth ordered an attack on Coruscant, and Thrawn agreed. First, as he often did, Myth Ra Nirodo feinted with a fake attack at the planet Mirist. This drew away the core sector fleet, which typically protected Coruscant. The New Republic most likely believed that their capital planet, even without the protective fleet, was untouchable. This would be tested. Thrawn entered the system with 8 interdictor cruisers, with 2 more plus 8 Katana dreadnoughts soon following. Immediately, the New Republic sends a recall notice to the sector fleet. However, Imperial forces destroy the sensor relay stations around Coruscant, making any sort of response or follow-up to the SOS impossible. Defensively, Coruscant was protected by 2 Golan 3 platforms, as well as ground-based cannons. Unfortunately, at this point, the Imperial fleet and the Golan cannons themselves were outside the range of the ground-based ion cannons. 6 Star Destroyers would soon appear, splitting up into 2 groups of 3 and heading towards the Golan platforms. At this point, The New Republic was launching their starfighters and gunships, and the smaller Imperial dreadnoughts and support vessels were moving to escort the Star Destroyers. As the Star Destroyers entered the goal and kill zones and began firing on the massive stations, interdictor cruisers move up to perform what was known as a Thrawn pincer. They activate their gravity well generators, allowing 2 Victory Star Destroyers to make ultra-precise jumps next to the weapons platforms where they're able to deliver a full broadside, almost piercing the shields. As this is happening, New Republic vessels are attempting to push back the Empire with no effect. Up to this point, the New Republic's response had been led by Admiral Drayson, a respected commander but not near the tactical genius of Thrawn. Eventually, the role shifts to Garm Bel Iblis, who immediately changes strategy. New Republic forces pull back near the planet, where they can be covered by the ion cannon. Bel Iblis knew that they were just wasting ships. Realistically, the Golden Threes could likely withstand an assault for some time, and likely long enough for the Sector fleet to return. Thrawn recognizes the change in strategy and realizes that Garm Bel Iblis probably just took command. That's fine, he decides to implement his ultimate plan. The Star Destroyers open their hangars and launch 22 cloaked asteroids. These asteroids, which are moved into position with the Star Destroyers' tractor beams, begin crashing into ships and enter orbit around the planet. Alongside the real asteroids, Thrawn also fakes the launch of 265 more. However, there's no way for the New Republic to tell which ones are cloaked and which ones just don't exist, because cloaking technology also removes things from sensor readings. So Thrawn effectively blockades Coruscant while using almost no resources. The New Republic is forced to keep the planetary shield up or risk a catastrophic asteroid crash. With the shield up, no one can leave or enter the planet, and there's no real way to quickly destroy the asteroids. This, however, was just one more step in Thrawn's ultimate plan. He knew the New Republic would now need to find the crystal grav field trap, which would be able to identify the cloaked asteroids. This all culminated with the Battle of Bilbringi, where he came very close to landing a death blow against the New Republic. The Star Wars galaxy was dominated by a few major starfighter, capital ship, weapons, and technology producers, and 2 of the largest corporations in the galaxy were Imperial Fleet Systems and Kuat Drive Yards. Although Kuat was most well known for their production of Imperial Star Destroyers and other capital ships, they made basically every type of war machine available, including at the end of the Clone Wars, the Eta-2 Actis and the V-Wing, fast, light Republic starfighters. Now, moving to after the fall of the Republic, Sinar, the other aforementioned corporation, was awarded most Imperial military starfighter contracts. And as the Essential Guide to Warfare explains, Sinar's greatest technological asset was its state-of-the-art engine systems. And the eventual twin ion engine of the TIE Fighter was the greatest the galaxy had ever seen, heavily efficient, fast, and reliable. With this engine, Sinar took the basics of KDY light starfighter designs, which fit well into their design philosophy, and made an effective, maneuverable, and fast, but ultimately cheap and stripped down fighter, the TIE. The TIE, as most of you guys know, fit the doctrine of the new Empire nicely, an empire which was finding itself as the ultimate, uncontested military force in the entire galaxy. They began pumping out offensively minded capital ships, leaving the carriers of the Republic in the Clone Wars. So instead of having ships built around fighters, lacking all forms of life support and hyperdrive, were instead attached to ships and a sort of protective extension of the Star Destroyer. And really that was fine until Rebel fighters truly came into their own. Then things got a bit more messy. Back to that in just a second. So, fighter advancements within the Empire were most often just improvements and refinements of the basic TIE model, and while these did yield some advanced designs like the TIE Defender, usually Imperial doctrine maintained the focus on cheap fighters. The TIE and later the TIE Interceptor would always make up the majority of the pre-Empire starfighter corps. And the use of the TIE became sort of a tradition within the Empire, one so strong that in the early post-Endor period, Izani Isard was unwilling to adopt superior Rebel fighters because she believed the Imperial TIE should be able to do everything that the X-Wing or the A-Wing could. Of course, that wasn't quite the reality. During and before the Imperial Civil War, the Empire was more than willing to take losses, and they did, both in fighters and personnel. largely due to shielding, and while some TIE pilots thought that the shielding on Rebel fighters made the pilots a bit less careful and attentive than those of TIEs, in reality, proportionally, TIE casualties were much worse. Of course, the highly militarized Empire had the advantage of sheer resources, so they could replace their ships, and any pilots who really stood out, aces or generally anyone who lived for very long, were often moved out of direct combat and into command roles, or at the very least into more specialized squadrons. But TIEs would be destroyed and they would be replaced, as would their pilots, all in service of the mighty, iconic Imperial Star Destroyer. Fighters were literally treated as disposable, and pilots were told not to get attached to their ships. However, this type of wastefulness, or at least this lack of care for resources, was no longer feasible after the Empire's loss at the Battle of Endor and its subsequent fracturing. The birth of the New Republic and the turning tides of the Civil War saw more than just a loss of assets, material, and pilots. That was significant, but there was also the disruption of supply lines and the fall of Kuat, Sluisvon, and countless other shipyards, both big and small, across the galaxy. Instead of a central power replacing lost ships, the new Imperial Warlords and claimants to the throne were instead presented with limited resources, and they were looking after themselves. There was no longer an endless supply of pilots and ships. So Imperial military doctrine across the galaxy was slowly changed, and pretty dramatically. Here's what the Essential Guide to Warfare says. After the Emperor's death, warlords such as Grand Admiral Thrawn saw their starfighter pilots as too valuable to leave poorly protected. They increasingly opted for more durable TIE models and retrofitted TIE interceptors with shields, saving poorly armored TIEs for droid brains to fly. But it was more than that. Subsequent Imperial fighter lines invented after Endor were almost always shielded. This included the Prey Bird, Star Hunter, Predator, the Galactic Alliance Heavy TIE Bomber, and much more. We also see, for example, that the Dark Empire specifically used a combination of cheap fighters and heavy fighters. Droid brains piloted the unshielded TIE Ds, while more advanced shadow droids, which were actually quasi-organic, were very expensive and well shielded. Basically, it all comes down to the fact that the Empire was no longer a monolithic, absolutely dominating force, and instead had to deal with resource scarcity. This ultimately led not only to the use of better TIE models, but more reasonable fleets. Star Destroyers were always used, but Thrawn brought in ships like the Lancer, Victory Star Destroyers saw an increased popularity, and new Star Destroyers like the Turbulent class were generally designed to be smaller and more reasonable.
In universe, what was the 1 year period where things were just awful? And we'll take this from a good guy's perspective. When did things really fall apart? When did our heroes or the heroes of the era just get smacked around so much that it made the 1 year period just a little bit different than any time else? And I mean, there are good single events which could qualify for this. The destruction of Hosnian Prime and really the first days of the First Order conflict from Star Wars canon, for example, or even the Purge of the Jedi, the destruction of Alderaan and associated rebel losses. I think you get the idea. However, there was a period of 1 to 2 years in Star Wars Legends where the Rebel Alliance, then the New Republic actually, faced an ungodly amount of threats of very serious magnitude. Did they win? Well, yeah, they kind of always do, but it was probably the single most taxing period, at least for the good guys in Star Wars history. Let's go to 9 years after the Battle of Yavin. I'll paint the picture. The New Republic has finally captured Coruscant and has established a full government, not only allied with systems across the galaxy, but effectively governing. The New Republic has finally gotten many of the Imperial remnant groups under control. The Empire itself is being diminished in territory, that is, until the reemergence of Grand Admiral Thrawn. I'm not going to start my timing for a year here until 6 months or so into his campaign. We'll call it like 9.5 ABY. And at that point, Thrawn basically had full support of Imperial remnant groups across the galaxy. He did something pretty interesting though. he left those commanders to take their own space, and with a small fleet, waged war against the New Republic. This war was both a traditional one and a psychological one waged against the elites within the New Republic. The galaxy's faith in Admiral Akbar, Mon Mothma, and even Leia seriously wavered as Thrawn continued his psychological attacks through useful idiots like Borsk Phalia. Through this campaign, Luke Skywalker is almost killed several times, the Katana fleet is seized by Thrawn and armed with tens of thousands of quickly produced Spartan clones, and many worlds would cede from the New Republic and join the Empire, impressed by Thrawn's tactical mastery. Although the New Republic would eventually defeat Thrawn at the Battle of Bilbringi, there were some serious scars across the galaxy starting to form. However, it wouldn't be long until the New Republic realized that the death of Thrawn certainly did not mean the death of the Empire. There were little skirmishes, most notably the Q-Trick campaign, but in 10 AVY, the New Republic would suffer, let's call it a setback, like they had never expected. After the New Republic's defeat of Admiral Krenel, there was a shocking unification of the Empire. Imperial warlords from across the galaxy met within the Deep Core and launched a stunning and completely devastating blitz against the galaxy. One of their first stops was Coruscant, and they bombarded the energy shield with their combined fleet to the point where the planet fell and the New Republic was forced into exile. It was not just Coruscant, however. Much of the core and the inner galaxy fell to the Empire. The New Republic essentially died, with the Rebel Alliance being forced back into existence. And if you stretch the timeline here, when you consider that this happened less than a year after the Thrawn campaign, you'll see why I titled the video the way I did, but it would get far worse. It's eventually revealed that the Empire has reunified under the command of a reborn Emperor Palpatine. But just as things were looking up for the Empire, well, it got even worse for the galaxy. This was an event known as the Imperial Mutiny. The reunified Empire once again split up and began vicious infighting, which saw countless worlds caught within catastrophic infighting. I'm talking super Star Destroyers crashing onto planetary surfaces, torpedo spheres just going off and firing onto everything around them. The practical explanation for this was that different arms of the Empire were simply fighting for domination, but it's also been heavily suggested that this was Palpatine. Palpatine punishing the Empire for abandoning him after his supposed death, and also trimming down the fat. But things would get worse, because Palpatine would unveil a series of new super weapons, including the World Devastators, which attacked the fortress of the New Republic, Mon Calamari, the Eclipse Dreadnought armed with a powerful continent-cracking, capital ship-destroying super laser, and the Galaxy Gun, which could annihilate planets from across the galaxy, although that part came a little later. On top of that all, Luke Skywalker had temporarily at least fallen to the dark side in an effort to destroy the Empire from within. Now, Luke would snap out of it, he would feed the New Republic the codes to defeat the World Devastators, and this first form of Palpatine, well, first returned form, would also be defeated, but of course this is the worst year of the New Republic's history, so Palpatine would return in another clone body, and it becomes fairly obvious that he can't die practically until his supply of clones runs out. At this point, Palpatine's Galaxy Gun is also firing. It can essentially wipe out a whole world from the stronghold of Biss. The new secret base of the Rebel Alliance, Pinnacle Base, is destroyed, along with it, presumably, a decent chunk of Rebel forces. As this is happening, and I'll just read this quote from the new Essential Chronology, the Emperor continued to launch his deadly projectiles, destroying unruly worlds and bringing the Resistance to its knees. Within a short time, Palpatine had regained key territories in the Inner and Outer Rim. The future of the New Republic looked bleak. Oh, also, there are more Dark Jedi ever running around now. So, in a year, you basically have a Starkiller base-like event. You have almost an Order 66 with the massive attack coming out of nowhere, Luke temporarily falling to the dark side, and that's alongside all of the nonsense associated with the Thrawn campaign. So much of what the New Republic worked for was wiped out in an instant. Now, in this darkness even, there would be some positives. As the chronology explains, with the New Republic destroyed, they were given the opportunity to create an even more effective form of government. I really want to talk about this in relation to the sequels and what will be Episode 10, Rey's movie, because I think there's something to look at here. I'll just read directly. A fresh start allowed them to establish a new system of government. The Provisional Council and position of Chief Counselor had worked effectively in the past, but that system was now viewed as the government that had lost core Coruscant to Palpatine. A new, more powerful single leader was desired, as well as a more clearly defined governmental hierarchy. Mon Mothma was elected Chief of State and President of the Senate. So I think you can probably see what I'll be talking about in that video and what you might be able to expect from the New Republic moving forward in Star Wars canon. But there was also another bit of light in all that darkness. Well, 3 bits of light, and this does kind of expose that what I've been calling a year is more like 2 years, but this period saw the birth of the 3 Solo children. Jaina and Jacen are born during the Thrawn trilogy, while Anakin is born during Dark Empire and nearly consumed by Palpatine. Not consumed, it's more like a spirit hopping. But in a way, I mean, that would also lead to some bad business. Jacen, well, watch my videos on Legacy of the Force, he turned into a little fascist himself. And Anakin, of course, would have a tragic death during the Yuuzhan Vong War. Jaina turned out alright, although she kind of married an Imperial on a Super Star Destroyer. Also worth a discussion another day.
Let's get started with a look at Palpatine himself. It might not surprise you to learn that unlike other Sith Lords of his era, Palpatine was not a big fan of the rule of 2. He was not interested in seeing the Sith lineage strengthened, rather he wanted himself to achieve power and as much power as possible, and to live forever. Palpatine spent a good deal of time before his death learning the ancient technique of spirit transference. As the name would suggest, spirit transference allows a very powerful Force user to basically move between bodies. After perfecting this technique, he created a cloning facility on Biss, which housed extra Palpatine bodies. A couple of years after his death, Palpatine was able to somehow return to the living by possessing the body of an Imperial. He would then move his spirit to a Palpatine clone, beginning his plans to take over the galaxy. It should be noted, however, that each one of these clones was highly corruptible by the dark side, so they wouldn't last very long. Thankfully for Palpatine, he had almost infinite reserves and could easily switch upon death. Palpatine's first resurrection actually occurred several years before Operation Shadowhand itself, his striking against the New Republic. He witnessed not only the fragmentation of Imperial forces, but the Thrawn campaign and other major galactic events. Operation Shadowhand itself was initiated during the height of the Imperial Civil War. Now, the Dark Empire comics aren't exactly clear on this, but it appears like sometime after the Thrawn campaign, several Imperial factions launched an attack and managed to capture the planet of Coruscant. Luke Skywalker, who is fighting at the Imperial City, is swept away to the core world of Biss by one of Palpatine's Force storms. Palpatine launches a major assault on the New Republic world of Mon Calamari, using his newly unveiled World Devastators, mobile factories which would tear a planet up using its resources to construct new Imperial military assets. While this is happening, Palpatine confronts Luke and actually manages to turn him to the dark side, although Luke does so only so he can defeat the new Empire from within. As proof of this, he sends shutdown codes for the World Devastators to the New Republic, who manages to stop the attack on Mon Calamari, but not before the planet is devastated. In an attempt to return Luke to the light side, Han and Leia allow themselves to be captured by Palpatine's forces. They confront the Jedi and the Sith on Biss, where Palpatine reveals that he intends to take the body of Leia's soon-to-be-born Anakin Solo. Leia and Han end up escaping and actually manage to steal a Jedi holocron. While this is happening, Luke, who is still fighting with the dark side, goes to Palpatine's cloning facilities and manages to destroy all but one of the clones. In response to this, Palpatine defeats Luke in a duel and further progresses his fall to the dark side. The next major battle is at Pinnacle Base, where Palpatine shows off his brand new Eclipse-class dreadnought. He demands that Leia return the Jedi holocron to him, and she goes on board. She helps Luke return from the dark side, and Palpatine and Luke once again duel. Luke manages to cut off the Sith Lord's hand and escapes with his sister. It should be noted that Luke only wins this duel where he lost the previous one because of the light side energy from Leia. During the Skywalker's escape, Palpatine summons a gigantic Force storm. Unfortunately for the Imperial forces, he loses control of it, and it sucks up not only a large portion of the two fleets, but also the Eclipse-class dreadnought and himself. Palpatine, however, had further auxiliary clones hidden away in the galaxy. However, several Imperial Darkside users actually managed to kill most of these in an attempt to take the Imperial throne for themselves. This was discovered by Cedrus, another Imperial Dark Jedi, who saw what his companions were doing and executed them. Cedrus himself would continue Operation Shadowhand until the return of Palpatine in his final clone body. This body, like all his clones, however, was deteriorating extremely quickly, not only to his immense dark side power, but as he discovered genetic tampering done by Imperial traders. Skirmishes would continue between the Empire and the New Republic for some time until the unveiling of the Galaxy Gun. The Galaxy Gun is used against several planets and military assets, and the tide of the war seems to be changing. Despite all of this, Palpatine is still in extremely poor health. Not only that, but the Galaxy Gun has also been having some maintenance issues. Several missiles were duds, allowing their targets to survive. Palpatine, realizing his time is short, consults with Sith spirits at the planet Korriban. They tell him that he cannot be healed and that his only real option is to transfer his essence to the body of the newborn Anakin Solo. Sidious collected all of his assets, including the new Eclipse II Superstar Destroyer, and headed to the planet Onderon, which had been a refuge for the Solo children throughout the war. At Onderon, a New Republic strike team boarded the Eclipse-class dreadnought. However, Palpatine was not on the ship. He had already went to the planet to try to take possession of Anakin Solo. Before Palpatine is able to destroy Leia and do so, Luke along with 2 other Jedi show up in order to fight the Emperor for a final time. He is, in the end, actually killed by Han Solo, who shoots him in the back. However, really that was all part of his plan. His spirit, now free of his body, heads towards the infant Anakin Solo. However, at the last moment, it's intercepted by the Jedi Empatijehos Brand, who vows to, with his strength along with the strength of every other deceased Jedi, hold Palpatine's soul in eternal darkness, unable to ever return. Meanwhile, several members of the New Republic, including Cam Solusar, Lando Calrissian, and R2-D2, have remained on the Eclipse. They managed to sabotage the ship's hyperdrive, sending it to the world Biss and the Galaxy Gun. The massive dreadnought crashes through the superweapon, and one of the special missiles from the Galaxy Gun explodes, destroying the 2 weapons and the planet Biss itself, thus ending Emperor Palpatine and Operation Shadowhand in one fell swoop. What would have happened had the Empire actually won the Battle of Endor? To actually have this discussion though, we have to consider what would really constitute a victory. First of all, Palpatine was obviously hoping to hit the Alliance with a death blow, removing their ability to resist the Empire in any sort of meaningful way. However, Palpatine's far more important goal was to turn Luke Skywalker to the dark side, using the battle itself as a catalyst for the Jedi's transition into a Sith, with the young Skywalker replacing his father, as Anakin at one point did with Dooku. So let's say Palpatine achieves this objective. What's his next step? Interestingly enough, the new canon version of the Complete Locations Guide actually spells it out in some detail. The Empire's first move would have been the assembling of massive fleets, which would have blockaded rebel sympathetic worlds, like Chandrila and Mon Cala, totally blockading them until the Death Star 2's completion. The station itself then would have destroyed the 2 planets and would have violently put down any future insurrections. One thing that I find very interesting is that the Legends version of this book, which is basically the exact same except with some details changed, didn't have this information. Instead, it really only says that Palpatine would have destroyed the planet of Endor, then moved the Death Star into operation. So I find this new bit of lore interesting, Palpatine mobilizing all of his forces and literally shutting down any remnants of the Rebel Alliance very quickly. As a note, I would like to thank SS Squat and Kamiboy from the Eckhart Slaughter Discord, who confirmed my memory and sent me scans of the aforementioned pages. But anyway, it seems obvious that Palpatine's ultimate plan wouldn't have ended with the subjugation of the galaxy, and really the aspects of running a full military and the Empire were always secondary in Legends and canon to furthering Palpatine's connection to the dark side and the Sith rule overall. In Legends, I believe that Palpatine's next step was one that we saw manifested several years later, the Dark Empire. As the Dark Empire sourcebook explains, Palpatine's ultimate goal was to create a universe-spanning empire, controlled not through military might, but the power of the dark side itself, and this is basically the ultimate point a Sith Lord can reach. Again, this isn't control of the Star Wars galaxy, this is control of all galaxies. I think that with the final elimination of the Jedi and consolidation of Palpatine's power within the galaxy, this would have been his next step, along with furthering his lifespan through advancements in clone technology. Now, in canon, as I've mentioned, Palpatine did seem a bit more worried about actually winning the battle for the galaxy. However, I believe that he and his new apprentice would have continued to look out and further the Sith rule, however, not quite so far, not on a universal scale, but rather, we know that Palpatine sensed something very disturbing and powerful within the unknown regions. He set up observatories on planets like Jakku to try and discover what was happening. I think he would have personally continued his mapping of the unknown regions and also directly tried to figure out what was out there. However, both scenarios have a similar thread. The Rebel Alliance, and more importantly, Luke Skywalker as the Last Jedi, were the final thing stopping Palpatine's ascension to the next level of power. Whether it's the exploration of the unknown regions or the formation of a strange dark empire, Palpatine was a megalomaniac, and he never would have stopped conquering. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Palpatine's most important goal was always to live forever. We learned this in the Plagueis novel, and it's been a pretty consistent theme for his character. Whether it was more work on cloning technology or Sith alchemy, I think this would have also been one of his major concerns with the Galactic Civil War now finished. Today, we'll be doing two of my favorite things, talking about Star Wars capital ships and looking at Imperial Warlords. Specifically, we'll be examining Enix Devian's restored empire and its fleet of Republic-era Star Destroyers. As many of you know, the Empire, without any sort of central leadership after the Battle of Endor, split into many sub-factions, many of which differ dramatically in philosophy, technology, and military strength. Moderate factions like Thrawn's Empire or Pelion's Imperial Remnant existed, and mostly sought to reinstate a strong central force in the galaxy. However, many factions instead exemplified the worst aspects of the Empire. And we saw militaries fall under those like the humanocentric Delic Krenal or the power-worshipping Brachus, and many more. The faction we'll be discussing today was one of the more vile, spewed from the corpse of the Empire, the Restored Empire. And before we talk about its military power, I think it's important to look at its leader, Enix Devian. Devian was an extraordinarily cruel and power-hungry man who had served within various arms of the Empire throughout his entire life. He was consistently and quickly promoted as a young man due to his absolute loyalty to Emperor Palpatine, as well as his total lack of empathy towards civilians, and of course his willingness to turn on his less dedicated colleagues. Devian's rise is described by part 2 of the Despoilers of the Empire article. Here's a quote. There, Devian's flair for brutally ferreting out any deficiency of jingoism disgusted party founder Artis Kane, beginning a lifelong feud. However, his rabid behavior also garnered party leader Kruya Van Don's approval, and ultimately Palpatine's personal notice. Now, it was very rare for Palpatine to show any sort of favor to non-Force sensitives, and Devian was given extra quote-unquote training with Lord Vader, who proceeded to destroy his face, removing his eye, and leaving Devian with lifelong scars. However, after achieving the Dark Lord's approval, Enix Devian was assigned to Compnor, where he set about hunting down disloyal Imperials and bringing to swift justice the enemies of the Emperor. During this time, he also began the process of collecting assets at a secluded asteroid base, and we're talking everything from blasters and small technology all the way up to large capital ships that would have been otherwise decommissioned. After the death of Palpatine, Devian returned to the asteroid but made no major plays for galactic power. Devian's faction, sometimes known as the Restored Empire or the Carinth Dissension, sought to return a brutal, extreme version of the Empire to the galaxy, and would stop at nothing to do so. The Restored Empire was more than willing to inflict massive civilian casualties, or destroy other Imperial sub-factions. That takes us to 13 ABY, which is of course prior to the Pelion-Gavrisson Treaty. There, the Dissension secured advanced weapons technology, and Devian planned to covertly bomb Coruscant, eliminating the political heart of the New Republic. These plans were aided by Yuzon Vong Scout Nama Nor, who was of course under disguise and hoping to sow instability across the galaxy. During his initial planning stages, former guardsman Kir Kanos was taken to RZ-7 611323, the covert asteroid, to meet Devian and see his stash of Imperial weapons. Crimson Empire 3 shows the massive stash of somewhat outdated technology. We're talking everything from V-Wings and Juggernauts all the way up to Venators and Acclimators. Devian reveals that these weapons, along with the Zenithium, the material from Nama Nor, were meant for a two-pronged assault on Coruscant. Kir Kanos was unwilling to inflict massive civilian casualties and left for Coruscant to warn the New Republic, unaware that a bomb was actually attached to his ship. Although Luke is able to stop the explosion from destroying a major part of Coruscant, this was ultimately the opening stages of Devian's attack. And in fact, Coruscant was not the real target. Devian was eyeing Pelion, who had reunified the Empire but changed it substantially. Pelion had moved the Empire to the Outer Rim and was actually considering peace with the New Republic. First, an attack is launched on an Imperial base as an attempt to spur the Empire into action against the New Republic. Assuming that the Imperial remnant would strike back and thus leave their planet of Orinda undefended, the Venator fleet attacked the planet with full force, and although their ships were significantly older than the Empire's ISDs, the restored Empire easily pushes through the defenses and wins the space battle. With the Imperial remnant's fleet dead in space, the attack progresses to the ground, with Devian ordering Pelion to submit to his authority and work with the restored Empire and to resume full-scale war against the New Republic. However, Imperial Baron Rajas Dasta had learned of and figured out Devian's betrayal and hidden fleets behind one of Orinda's moons, which in turn ravaged the restored Empire's aging warships. Kanos then killed Devian in one-on-one combat, effectively ending the threat of the restored Empire. So what I've just described is basically the plot of Crimson Empire 3. I find it interesting because of course we see Imperial factions jostling for power. We see one that is remarkably more cruel and evil, almost symbolic of the worst aspects of Palpatine's Empire, while Pelion, as always, is a shining example of a good Imperial. I also like it because we get some more context about what happened with the Republic's Venators. We know not only that many were decommissioned, but that Imperial warlords, if powerful enough during the Empire's heyday, could have stashed some assets away for future use. We also know the Venator wasn't so outclassed by the ISD that they'd have no chance in space combat, and you know what, the Republic-era starfighters actually seem to do fairly well against the TIEs, but I don't think that's very surprising.
The Black Fleet Crisis is an interesting trilogy in Star Wars Legends. It's focused probably more than any other Star Wars series on military science fiction. In fact, the trilogy opens with the creation of the New Republic's Fifth Fleet. The book spends a lot of time talking about how the New Republic has deployed their fleets across the galaxy, and basically the Fifth Fleet, as I've covered in prior videos, is used primarily as a roving defense force made up of brand new ships like Nebula and Endurance-class Star Destroyers. Anyway, during this time period, the New Republic is sort of coming to terms with the fact that they are now the most powerful faction in the galaxy. There really is no other group which can stand up and just eliminate the New Republic in one fell swoop, and arguably that's led to a little bit of complacency. However, one discovery threatened the balance of military power in the galaxy. In 16 ABY, the New Republic manages to recover a complete Imperial Order of Battle. An Order of Battle is basically a listing of all Imperial assets in the galaxy. One man over New Republic asset tracking basically takes some time, goes through the Order of Battle, compares it with known and destroyed Imperial vessels, and discovers that there are several fleets operating in one area of space which have not been accounted for. These fleets were a part of Black Sword Command, which, according to New Republic intelligence in Before the Storm, defended the center of the Empire's rim territories: Praxilus, Caridian, the entire Kokash and Farlak sectors. And this was a lot of firepower, not enough to challenge the New Republic in outright war, but probably enough to, for example, take Coruscant if the entire might of the home fleet was not present. Specifically, at last count, Black Sword Command was made up of 44 capital ships, including 3 super Star Destroyers. So what happened to the ship? Well, this is where the central crisis of the book comes in. After the Battle of Endor, Izani Isard, who was the acting leader of the Empire, ordered that the Black 15 shipyard and all other shipyards in the area be scuttled alongside any ships in construction or repair in order to prevent their capture by the New Republic. Here's what actually happened. As the Empire was preparing to scuttle their ships, the workers, which they had enslaved, and who were known as the Yvathan, staged an uprising and wiped out all Imperial forces, securing the capital ships. Now, the Yvathan had achieved spaceflight, but not faster than light travel by the time the Empire found their territory in the Farlak sector and subjugated them. But they were very technologically adept, and with these new captured Imperial vessels, they were quite powerful. The Yvathan spent over a decade from that point learning the intricacies of Imperial capital ships, repairing and building ships which were in dock, and even building some of their own vessels, the very unique thrust ships. All in all, by the events of the Black Fleet crisis, the new Black Fleet of the Yvathan was made up of 3 super Star Destroyers plus about 60 other Imperial vessels, all the way from battlecruiser and Star Destroyer down to Victory class. Additionally, the Black Fleet also made use of the experimental XF ship, which I'll probably cover in another video, and perhaps hundreds of smaller, what were called thrust ships, basically small circular vessels which could fire in every direction. Anyway, the Yvathan, who formed the Duskon League, after throwing off the yoke of the Empire, spent some time colonizing worlds, and stayed extremely segregated from the rest of the galaxy. Visitors were not allowed in and were killed on sight, and the Yvathan did not leave their territory. That is until 16 ABY, when leader of the Duskon League, Nil Spar, took a thrust ship to Coruscant in what was supposed to be a diplomatic meeting. In fact, however, Nil Spar was simply creating political credibility for what would become an atrocity scene galaxy-wide. Nil Spar spent months meeting with Princess Leia, who at that point was Chief of State of the New Republic. So long, in fact, that by the time he was ready to leave, Nil Spar was able to portray the New Republic as forcibly keeping them on world. The New Republic also was not aware of the Black Fleet within the Duskon League's possession, and Leia was trying really hard to broker some sort of cooperation or perhaps even New Republic membership out of the relationship. However, others within the New Republic military, especially Admiral Akbar, were very worried about the Duskon League and thought that they might in fact be in possession of the ships of Black Sword Command. So spies were illegally sent within the Kunat cluster and within Duskon League territory and were immediately destroyed. By this point, Nil Spar had returned to home space, and the Duskon League used this act of espionage alongside the fact that the 5th Fleet had recently been sent into the area to justify major acts of aggression against nearby star systems, and I'm talking about major. The Duskon League would commit what they referred to as a purge against other colonies within their part of the galaxy. The Duskon League, of course, was extraordinarily xenophobic. They saw other alien species as dirty and basically unworthy of sharing the galaxy with them. This is partially because the Duskon League developed in isolation for so long that they really thought they were the center of the galaxy. The Purge basically claimed any colonized world within the Kunat cluster, and we actually see this played out from the perspective of victims of the Purge at the end of the novel, and it's actually quite horrifying. On the farming world of Brigia, we see colonists slaughtered by Yvathans who landed on thrust ship in hand-to-hand combat, and on Poloni, the planet was bombarded from orbit, and it was really quite horrifying. Poloni would actually become a very important moment in this conflict, however. because one individual known as Plat Malar would actually record the entire events and would flee the system. The crazy thing was, he fled in a TIE Interceptor, a vessel which did not have a hyperdrive, and it was only through chance that he and his footage was recorded. I say this was an important moment because this footage would help break the political maneuvering that the Duskon League was using against the New Republic and would expose their actions for what they were, barbaric and xenophobic. By the time this stage of the Purge was over, probably a dozen colonies had been wiped out, with the Duskon League moving in to claim their territory and resources. In response, the New Republic would send the state-of-the-art 5th Fleet, which was already heading to the region to look for the ships of Black Sword Command, to protect all other colonies from the Avathan. At this point, many worlds were petitioning the New Republic for membership and thus defense.
By 12 ABY, the Empire had suffered a series of devastating defeats. First, Thrawn is killed at the Battle of Bilbringi, then the Dark Empire is ended at Onderon with the loss of Biss and several superweapons. The Empire would then reunify under the command of Natasi Dala, but she would almost immediately screw things up with a failed attack on Luke's Jedi Academy. This left the now quite weakened Empire under the control of Admiral Pellaeon. Pellaeon, realizing that the Empire could never truly flourish and return to power if limited to the deep core, decided that he would take what remaining resources he did have and move to the Outer Rim. However, before doing so, he conducted raid and searches on all remaining Imperial shipyards and facilities. He thought that prior to reunification, some of the warlords may have stashed assets away. He was correct, and his find was far greater than he could have dreamed of: 2 Imperial dreadnoughts, the Megador and the Dominion. These 2 ships, along with the Reaper, former flagship of Artus Kane of the Pentastar alignment, gave Pellaeon 3 Super Star Destroyers. Pellaeon's first move was to take his forces to the planet Orinda. Splitting his 3 dreadnoughts up, he managed to take a variety of systems near the galactic core. In a very Pellaeon fashion, he contacted the New Republic and stated that so long as they weren't aggressive with his new territory, he would not push back. Basically, now that the Empire had at least some sort of real territory, he was fine with no further offensives. The New Republic either didn't believe Pellaeon or was too scared of unchecked Imperial power, and in response, dispatched the Lusankya and Rogue Squadron. The Lusankya was a captured Imperial Super Star Destroyer, and this marked one of the first times the New Republic heavily relied on dreadnoughts. Typically, the New Republic preferred a mobile fleet with a focus on starfighter carrying and self-sufficient carriers. Realizing that the New Republic was not aware of the survival of the Dominion and the Megador, Pellaeon kept those 2 dreadnoughts in waiting while flaunting the Reaper. He lured the Lusankya, pulling back each time further into his captured territory. The 2 dreadnoughts clashed but could never land a killing or even damaging blow. In response, the New Republic dispatched an Endurance-class fleet carrier, loaded with top-of-the-line E-Wings. Several other ships were also attached to the fleet, including various Mon Calamari cruisers. The New Republic was very willing to dedicate assets to this cause, as they believed the Reaper was the final intact Imperial Super Star Destroyer. Finally, we have the Battle of Orinda. Pellaeon had pulled back through so many systems that this fight was taking place over the planet, which really started the whole conflict. This time, instead of retreating, Pellaeon held his ground. The New Republic appeared, engaging the Super Star Destroyer with its own dreadnought in a fierce broadside barrage. The Endurance-class fleet carrier was also moved into position, but the E-Wings were held in reserve. The captain of the Endurance wanted to show off the capability of the new E-Wing and first wanted the Lusankya to pound down the shields of the dreadnought. However, this was all a trap by Pellaeon. 6 interdictor cruisers jumped into the system and moved into position to prevent a New Republic retreat. Moments later, the Empire's forces were again supplemented, this time by the Super Star Destroyer Dominion. The Endurance was almost immediately destroyed, not having even launched its fighters, and the Lusankya was on the verge of destruction. Thankfully, Rogue Squadron was able to clear out the interdictors, allowing the fleet to escape, but this was nonetheless a victory for the Empire, and they still held the Megador in secret. Under command of the surviving Imperial Moffs, Pellaeon was ordered to turn this victory into a major offensive campaign. The Reaper was destroyed at the Battle of Selenon by famed New Republic officer Admiral Etan Abbot. The New Republic's 4th, 3rd, and 5th fleets were also brought into action, winning decisive battles at Cholumus, Champala, Kataris, and Tangreen. Finally, we have the Empire's devastating defeat at Anx Minor. There, Pellaeon used his 2 remaining dreadnoughts, as well as a support fleet, including notably a Serannon-class Star Destroyer, scavenged from the Duskon League after the Black Fleet crisis. The New Republic responded with the Guardian Super Star Destroyer, which had been attached to the 3rd Fleet under the command of Admiral Akbar, and he was able to take advantage of a known design flaw in the Serannon, hitting the ship's weak spot, exploding an antimatter, and causing massive damage to Pellaeon's fleet, including the Megador. The Admiral was ordered to retreat, and this was really the last major conflict between the New Republic and the Empire. This whole campaign is notable in my mind because Pellaeon did not want to launch a campaign against the New Republic. First, he was forced to respond by an overly defensive and reactionary New Republic. Then, he was sent on the offensive by war-hungry Moffs, who really wanted nothing more than to restore the former glory of the Empire through battle and destruction. This campaign would result in the destruction of 1 Super Star Destroyer, the damaging of the Megador, and the loss of countless other small ships. It also represented the undoing of countless years of reunification and rebuilding, and after this point, there was no serious chance of a return to Imperial glory. During the Kahamas crisis, the Gaversum-Pellaeon Treaty was signed, formally ending the Galactic Civil War. The Battle of Endor saw not only the destruction of a Sith power which had been building in secret for thousands of years, but also the fracturing of Imperial rule throughout the galaxy. However, though never reobtaining its former glory, the Empire would nonetheless survive in various different forms, primarily as antagonists to the New Republic, the nascent but now dominant political force throughout the galaxy. Today, we dig deep into the Star Wars Legends Expanded Universe to better understand the post-Endor eras of Imperial power. Largely understood as lasting from the Battle of Endor in 4 ABY to the re-emergence of Thrawn in 9 ABY, the defining aspect of the first post-Endor era was interfactional conflict. As the New Republic struggled to establish a functional government responsible for thousands of star systems, Imperials across the galaxy, now without central leadership or a unifying force, began carving out their own domains, seizing the starships, soldiers, and other military assets under their previously legitimate command. These new warlords jostled with each other and the New Republic for control of resources and systems. Though warlords did exist until Imperial reunification and beyond, it was this time period which saw the most numerous and powerful independent splinter groups. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of minor and major warlords, far too many to chronicle here, and the power of a warlord was largely determined by naval strength. Imperial Admiral ZSINJ, who had been overseer of the Quelli Oversector, rose to immediate prominence after Endor due to the sheer size of his territory and his control of the Brawl, an Executor-class Super Star Destroyer, which he later renamed the Iron Fist. ZSINJ's territory grew so large that the New Republic was forced to treat it as a quasi-legitimate government, and his presence in the galactic northeast seriously limited the growth of other warlord factions, including the Greater Maldred and the Pentastar alignment. For some time, and really until his death, ZSINJ's faction was the second most powerful force in the entire galaxy. Eventually, ZSINJ's growing power and his natural aggressive tendencies caused him to attack and aggravate the New Republic directly. In response, Solo Command was formed, a dedicated fleet with the sole purpose of killing the warlord. And after a long campaign, ZSINJ was finally defeated by a combined New Republic Capes Consortium fleet at the Battle of Dathomir. Another major warlord during this era was Azani Isard. After assassinating the last legitimate aspect of Imperial power, the ruling council, Isard took control of Coruscant, otherwise known as Imperial Center. From there, she terrorized the galaxy with the Lusankya, an Executor-class Super Star Destroyer, and a mobile reconditioning base. Eventually, she would cede a poisoned Coruscant to the New Republic and would fight a long but ultimately unsuccessful campaign against Rogue Squadron. Like the other warlords of this era, Isard would ultimately fail to consolidate her power in a meaningful way and would never achieve anywhere near the same success as Warlord ZSINJ. Other major players during this time were Sate Pestage, General Delvardis, and countless others. In 9 ABY, as the New Republic began to beat back the various Imperial groups across the galaxy, Myth Ra Nirodo reappeared from the unknown regions and waged a devastating campaign against the galaxy. Myth Ra Nirodo, otherwise known as Thrawn, was one of 12 Imperial Grand Admirals. A single Grand Admiral represented an extraordinarily grave threat, and Thrawn was arguably the greatest military mind to ever exist. Unlike the many self-serving warlords, Thrawn's command was seen as righteous and legitimate, and his return saw a degree of unification between many warlord factions. Still, the Chiss possessed only limited assets and was forced to rely on his incredible gifts of insight and planning. Thrawn immediately began procuring assets and waged a war on two fronts against the New Republic, both sowing confusion and discord within Republic High Command and winning several major naval victories. Thrawn's unparalleled ability led many in the galaxy to believe him unbeatable. His unique use of technology, esoteric science, and his partnership with the Dark Jedi clone Jorah Sabayoth demoralized his enemies and caused hundreds of systems to flock back to the Empire. The campaign ended in the Inner Rim. Thrawn, who had tricked the New Republic into a trap at the Bilbringi shipyards, was assassinated in the midst of battle by his Nogri bodyguard Rook. Whether he would have won the Battle of Bilbringi is uncertain due to the intervention of the Smugglers' Alliance, but either way, Thrawn brought the New Republic to the brink and represented the most serious threat to the ruling government until the Yuuzhan Vong. Almost immediately after the death of Thrawn, a mysterious entity began summoning Imperial assets to the deep core, one of the remaining areas in the galaxy where the Empire maintained a strong presence, with various fortress worlds, fleets, shipyards, and research stations still operating. The source of this message was revealed to be Palpatine, his spirit having fought its way back from the afterlife and now inhabiting a new clone body. The Emperor had been watching the remnants of the Empire for some time, both disappointed by the disloyalty shown by his subjects and the various infighting, but also impressed by the recent actions of Thrawn. However, his choice to not intervene during the Thrawn campaign was a conscious one. His own megalomania and desire for absolute power dictated that Thrawn must die. Palpatine also used the distraction caused by the war to grow more powerful without Republic oversight. Palpatine's reemergence unified the Warlord factions far more than Thrawn's had, and his forces were soon supplemented by thousands of capital ships and innumerable Imperial officers. Using cutting-edge, never-before-seen superweapons, including the World Devastators, the Galaxy Gun, and the Eclipse Dreadnoughts, as well as dark side-imbued technology, Palpatine initiated Operation Shadow Hand in 10 ABY, recapturing Coruscant as well as thousands of other star systems, effectively rebalancing the galactic scales of power. However, Palpatine was not interested in recreating the formal rule. He had something much more sinister planned, a dark empire, where control of the universe was propagated not only through weapons of war, but the dark side of the Force itself. He was, however, killed for a final time during the Battle of Onderon, which also saw the destruction of the Galaxy Gun, the Fortress World of Biss, his Eclipse II Dreadnought, and much of his fleet. The overwhelming and absolute loss experienced by the Empire during the Dark Empire crisis weakened Imperial powers moving forward, crippled most of the remaining warlords, and marked the beginning of the end. Not only were countless assets lost through the campaign, but several important individuals, including Artus Cain of the Pentastar Alignment, were killed in battle. As I mentioned, the years after Operation Shadow Hand saw a reduction in Imperial strength throughout the galaxy. The New Republic now largely faced non-Imperial threats, including the Duskon League, and I would argue that the Empire spent more time fighting each other for remaining resources than waging any sort of effective campaign against the rebels. In 11 ABY, Imperial Admiral Natasi Dalla returned to the galaxy at large, having spent years guarding the secret Maw installation. Dalla hated the New Republic, but was also disgusted by how the Empire had totally dissolved into civil war in less than a decade. Working with former Thrawn second-in-command Gilad Pellaeon, Dalla contacted 12 prominent warlords and organized a meeting at Toss Beacon. Although her goal had been a peaceful reunification of the Empire, old rivalries and hatred were clearly too entrenched for the groups to work together moving forward. Dalla instead murdered the warlords, seizing control of their now leaderless factions and creating a unified Imperial remnant. This remnant was seen by many as the final chance to restore Imperial power and greatness to the galaxy. Dala reinvigorated idle allies, effectively managed existing assets, and began rebuilding the Imperial Navy. The remnant also restarted the Galactic Civil War, launching lightning strikes against the New Republic, using a unique fleet of Victory Star Destroyers known as the Crimson Command to devastate worlds and military installations. However, a failed attack on Luke Skywalker's Jedi Praxium on Yavin, which saw the loss of dozens of ships, including the Nighthammer and Executor Super Star Destroyer, forced Dala to step back from the remnant, relinquishing command to Admiral Pelion. Unfortunately, by this point, the Empire had been grinded down by years of fighting, and unlike the New Republic, was not replacing lost ships or improving on technology. This meant that even a single unified Imperial Remnant faction was reduced to, at best, a quasi-legitimate government with a few sectors in the Outer Rim. After a series of losses against the strong New Republic military, formal fighting slowed to almost nothing, and in 19 ABY, Fleet Admiral Pelion approached the New Republic to negotiate peace. The Galactic Civil War was formally ended during the Ka'amos Crisis. The Empire was able to maintain full autonomy as well as a portion of space, and systems were free to join either the Empire or the New Republic. But any hopes for a return to Imperial greatness were now gone. The New Republic and the Empire would cooperate moving forward, especially during the Yuuzhan Vong Crisis, and would join as a single government with the creation of the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances.